Sweetheart, top these off before the real meeting starts. Dr. Donald Pemberton did not look at her when he said it. He held out the empty coffee mug at shoulder height with 2 fingers, the way a man holds something he expects to be relieved of without effort, and he kept walking past her into the corridor that led to the executive boardroom of Viridian Pharmaceuticals on the 42nd floor of the Hartwell Tower in downtown Boston. Jessica Mensah did not take the mug. She let his hand hang in the air between them for one long second. She was holding a tablet in her left hand and a slim leather folio in her right. And she was wearing a charcoal suit that had been tailored in London, and she was standing exactly where the board chair's executive assistant had asked her to wait until the 8:30 briefing was ready to begin. Donald did not register any of this. What he registered was a black woman, mid-40s, standing alone outside the boardroom with what he assumed was a clipboard, and what he had decided, somewhere between the elevator and the corner of the hallway, was that she was the new catering coordinator from the building services contract that had rotated last month. He pushed the mug a half-inch closer to her shoulder. 2 creams, no sugar. And there's a carafe on the credenza inside that's been sitting since 7. Run a fresh pot, we've got 14 people coming in. Jessica looked at the mug, then she looked at Donald. He was 61 years old, 6'2", with the kind of silver hair that had been cultivated rather than allowed, and a navy blazer with a small gold lapel pin shaped like a molecule. He was the chief scientific officer of Viridian Pharmaceuticals. He had been with the company for 22 years. He had 15 days earlier been informed by the board that he would not be promoted to chief executive officer despite what he had spent the last 4 years assuming was a guaranteed succession. He had not slept well since. He had not been particularly pleasant to anyone in the lab tower since. And he had, at precisely 7:53 this morning, decided that the very first thing he was going to do at this quarterly review was take a small, satisfying ounce of authority back from the universe, even if he had to take it from a woman he had never met, in a hallway, over a cup of coffee. Jessica set her folio down on the narrow console table beside her. She did not take the mug. She did something else. She reached past it, slid it gently out of his fingers, and placed it on the table next to her folio. "I'll let your assistant know the carafe needs attention, Dr. Pemberton." Her voice was level. Her accent was difficult to place. The kind of accent that belongs to someone who was born in one country, schooled in a second, and has spent the last 15 years in a third. Donald's hand stayed in the air for a half-second after the mug was gone. Then it dropped. He looked at her for the first time. He looked at her properly. He took in the suit and the tablet and the folio and the small platinum pin on her lapel that he could not quite read from where he was standing. And a tiny crease appeared between his eyebrows, the kind of crease that arrives in a man's face when his brain has begun processing information his ego has not yet authorized it to consider. "I'm sorry, do I? We have not met. I believe we are about to." She picked up the folio. She did not pick up the mug. She turned and she walked past him into the boardroom, where 13 members of the Viridian Board of Directors and the company's general counsel and the head of investor relations and a single representative from a New York law firm were already seated around a 40-foot table of black walnut, beneath a glass ceiling, beside a wall-mounted molecular sculpture of the company's flagship cardiovascular compound, waiting for the 8:30 meeting to begin. The chair of the board, William Hartwell, stood up the moment Jessica walked through the door. He had not stood up for anyone else that morning. He extended his hand. He smiled with his entire face. "Dr. Mensah, thank you for being early." Behind Jessica, in the corridor she had just left, Dr. Donald Pemberton picked up the coffee mug she had set on the console table. He looked at it. He looked at the open boardroom door. He looked at the mug again. And for the first time in 22 years at Viridian Pharmaceuticals, his hand was not entirely steady. To understand how a senior pharmaceutical executive came to be standing alone in a hallway at 8:26 in the morning, holding an empty mug he had just tried to give to the incoming chief executive officer of his own company. You need to back up. You need to back up about 30 years. To understand who Dr. Jessica Mensah actually was, not who Donald Pemberton had constructed in his head in the half-second between the elevator and the corner of the hallway, you have to go back to a small concrete floor pharmacy in the Adabraka district of Accra, Ghana, where her father had compounded medications by hand for 31 years. Kwame Mensah had trained at the University of Ghana Medical School in the late 1960s, had been one of 3 black African students offered a postgraduate fellowship at Imperial College London in 1973, and had come home 2 years later with a master's degree in pharmaceutical chemistry and a determination to build something useful in the country he had been born into. He had not become rich. He had become, by every measure that mattered to him, useful. Jessica had grown up in the apartment above the pharmacy. She had spent her afternoons at a small wooden table behind the counter, watching her father weigh powders on a brass balance scale that had belonged to his father, listening to him explain to mothers in the neighborhood why one syrup was for a cough and another was for a fever, and why both of them needed to be measured to the exact milliliter. She had learned to read the labels in 3 languages, English and French and Twi, before she had learned to ride a bicycle. Her mother, at Mensa, had been a biology teacher at a girls' secondary school in the Tima neighborhood, and she had brought home a stack of borrowed textbooks every Friday afternoon and read them to Jessica at the kitchen table because she had decided very early that her only daughter was going to know more chemistry by the age of 15 than most adults in any country would know by the end of their lives. When Jessica was 12 years old, a counterfeit batch of paracetamol had moved through a market in the next district. 11 children had died over the course of 9 days. Her father had spent the next 3 weeks driving from village to village in a borrowed truck, identifying every bottle of the bad batch he could find and pulling it off shelves with his own hands. He had come home one of those nights, sat down at the kitchen table without taking off his coat, and said to her, "Jessica, somebody knew, somebody at the factory knew, and somebody signed the paper that let it leave the gate, and somebody decided that money on a quarterly report was worth more than 11 children. I want you to understand that this is a problem of paperwork and signatures. It is not a problem of accidents." She had remembered that sentence for the rest of her life. She had earned a full scholarship to study chemistry at McGill University in Montreal at the age of 17. She had earned her doctorate in medicinal chemistry at Johns Hopkins 5 years after that, with a dissertation on the kinetics of sustained-release glucose-modulating compounds that her advisor had described as the cleanest piece of pharmacological writing he had read in his 30-year career. She had taken her first job at a mid-sized pharmaceutical company in New Jersey, and within 2 years she had been promoted to lead a research team. Within 4, she had been promoted again. Within 6, she had discovered something that she had not been allowed to forget. She had discovered that her senior vice president, a man whose name she would later be advised not to publicly repeat, had been quietly sitting on adverse event data from a Phase 3 trial because the data was inconvenient to a launch timeline. She had brought the data to the head of regulatory. The head of regulatory had brought it to legal. Legal had brought it to the CEO. The CEO had thanked her for her diligence. 2 months later, she had been reassigned to a non-research role in Singapore. 6 months after that, she had resigned. She had not gone to the press. She had not filed a lawsuit. She had done something else instead. She had applied to the United States Food and Drug Administration. She had spent the next 11 years inside the agency, 4 of them in the Office of New Drugs and the last 6 in the Office of Compliance, building a quiet, methodical reputation as the investigator you sent in when a paper trail had been deliberately laundered and you needed someone who could read a chemistry log the way other people read a confession. She had led 23 investigations into the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. She had closed 14 of them with structural consent decrees. She had closed 7 with criminal referrals. She had closed 1 with a sealed settlement so large that the company's quarterly filings had buried the line item under a category labeled simply Other Litigation Provisions, Ongoing. That company had been Viridian Pharmaceuticals. The drug had been called Glytherix. The lead investigator had signed the closing memorandum on a Tuesday afternoon in March of last year. Her name on the signature line had read Dr. Jessica A. Mensah, Director, Office of Compliance. Glytherix had been a once-daily extended-release sulfonylurea metformin combination tablet marketed to type 2 diabetes patients between the ages of 45 and 70, and Viridian Pharmaceuticals had pushed it through to FDA approval in March of 2019. On a timeline that had impressed every competitor in the cardiometabolic space and concerned exactly one person inside the company. That person had been Dr. Rachel Liu, the lead chemist on the formulation team, a 38-year-old PhD out of Stanford with 7 years at Viridian and a reputation for precision that had bordered on stubbornness. Rachel had documented, in 3 separate internal memoranda between October of 2017 and June of 2018, that the extended-release coating used in Glytherix had been performing inconsistently under accelerated stability conditions, and that approximately 1 in every 900 tablets in her test batches had been dissolving within 12 minutes of administration, rather than the 8 to 10 hour window the formulation had been designed to deliver. A 1 in 900 dissolution failure on a sulfonylurea was not a minor matter. It meant that on any given day, somewhere in the country, a diabetic patient would absorb their entire week's worth of pancreatic stimulation in less than a quarter of an hour, and their blood sugar would crash through the floor, and they would either be on the freeway when it happened, or they would be alone in their kitchen, or they would be in their bed at 3 in the morning, and they would not always wake up. Rachel had taken the memoranda to her direct supervisor, who had taken them to the vice president of formulation, who had taken them to the chief scientific officer. The chief scientific officer had been Dr. Donald Pemberton. Donald had read the memoranda. He had called Rachel into his office on a Friday afternoon in July of 2018. He had explained to her, in the tone of a man explaining something patiently obvious to a junior employee who had not yet learned how the real world worked, that the dissolution variance she was observing was within an acceptable statistical envelope, that the Phase 3 data did not support a delay of the regulatory filing, and that the launch was going to proceed on the schedule the board had already approved. He had asked her, with a small, careful smile, whether she was certain she wanted to be the chemist who had pushed back on the company's most important launch in a decade. Rachel had said she was certain. Donald had thanked her for her perspective. 11 days later, Rachel had been notified by Human Resources that her position was being eliminated as part of a routine departmental restructuring. She had been escorted out of the building at 4:15 in the afternoon. Her badge had been deactivated by the time she reached the parking garage. She had spent the following 6 months looking for another job in the same field, and she had discovered, in a way that no one ever puts in writing but that everybody in pharma understands, that her name had been quietly placed on a list. She had eventually found a research position at a small biotech in Cambridge at 60% of her previous salary, and she had kept her head down for 9 months. And then in April of 2019, 3 weeks after Glytherix had been approved by the FDA, she had opened a sealed manila envelope she had been keeping in a safe deposit box at a bank in Somerville since the day before her badge had been deactivated, and she had read through her own original memoranda one more time, and she had picked up a phone, and she had called the FDA Office of Compliance, and she had asked to speak with someone about a coding failure on a recently approved product. The person who had returned her call 40 minutes later had been Dr. Jessica Mensah. The investigation had taken 6 years. By the time the sealed settlement was signed, Glytherix had been pulled from the market. 14 patients had died, an additional 311 had been hospitalized with documented hypoglycemic events linked to dissolution failures, and Viridian Pharmaceuticals had paid out an aggregate of $2.3 billion across the federal settlement, the multi-district patient litigation, and a quiet round of bilateral settlements with state attorneys general in 9 separate jurisdictions. The whistleblower's identity had been protected under the sealing order. The board of Viridian had spent the 8 months following the settlement looking for a chief executive officer who could lead the company through what their counsel had described as an existential reputational and regulatory crisis. They had interviewed 11 candidates. They had hired the one woman in the country who already knew, in granular forensic detail, exactly what had gone wrong inside the company and exactly who had let it happen. They had announced her appointment internally 7 days before her start date. Donald Pemberton had not read the announcement carefully. He had skimmed the name. He had not searched the name. Donald Pemberton had woken up at 5:47 that morning, in the master bedroom of a 4-bedroom colonial in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and the first conscious thought he had registered before his eyes had fully opened had been the same thought that had been waiting for him every morning for 15 days. He had not gotten the job. He had been at Viridian Pharmaceuticals for 22 years. He had been chief scientific officer for 11 of them. He had presided over the development pipeline that had produced 6 commercial products. He had survived 3 CEOs, 4 general counsels, and a hostile takeover attempt in 2014 that he had personally helped repel through a midnight call to an institutional investor in Geneva. He had been told, not in writing, but in the unmistakable language of corporate succession, that the next chief executive of Viridian Pharmaceuticals was going to be him. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon in October, the board chair William Hartwell had called him into the small conference room on the 43rd floor and had explained to him with a great deal of careful phrasing that the board had decided, in light of the Glytherix matter and the consent decree obligations and the need for what William had described as fresh external credibility, to bring in an outside chief executive. Donald had not been told the new CEO's name. He had been told only that the appointment would be announced internally before the quarterly board review and that William would personally introduce the new chief executive to the senior leadership team at that meeting. Donald had walked out of the conference room that afternoon and had driven home in a silence so complete that he had not noticed when his car had drifted across the center line of Route 9 and a delivery truck had blown its horn at him from the oncoming lane. He had been drinking more than usual since he had been short with his wife. He had been short with his assistant. He had been short with the head of formulation chemistry, who had finally stopped scheduling their Friday morning stand-ups because there was no longer any point. And he had decided, somewhere in the long sleepless hours between 3 and 5 that morning, that he was going to walk into the quarterly review with the bearing of a man who had not lost anything. He was going to be charming. He was going to be precise. He was going to demonstrate, in the small unconscious gestures that the board members would register without noticing they were registering, that he was still the most important scientific mind in the room, and that whatever stranger William had decided to parachute in from outside was going to be sitting next to a man whose absence the company could not afford. He had arrived at the building at 7:52. He had taken the executive elevator directly to 42. He had walked through the executive suite past 3 assistants who had each greeted him by name and none of whom had returned his greeting because he had not given one. He had stopped at the credenza outside the boardroom. There had been a stainless steel carafe on the credenza, and it had been sitting since the morning catering team had set up at 7, and the coffee inside it had cooled to the temperature of a man's resentment. He had poured himself a cup. He had taken one sip. He had grimaced, and he had picked up the empty mug from the table beside the carafe and had walked out into the corridor, looking for someone to send for a fresh pot. The first person he had seen in the corridor had been a black woman in a charcoal suit holding a tablet. He had not seen her face. He had seen her tablet and her posture and the absence of any other staff member in his immediate field of vision, and his brain had performed the small unconscious calculation that brains of a certain kind have been performing in corridors and lobbies and conference rooms for as long as there have been corridors and lobbies and conference rooms. The calculation had returned a result. The result had been catering. He had walked toward her. He had not slowed down. He had not made eye contact. He had extended the mug at shoulder height, and he had said the words, "Sweetheart, top these off before the real meeting starts," in the voice of a man who had been waiting 15 days for an opportunity to feel, however briefly, like the most important person in a hallway. 40 seconds later, he was standing alone, watching the new chief executive officer of Viridian Pharmaceuticals walk through the boardroom door without him, holding nothing in his hand but the cooling cup he had tried to give her, and beginning very slowly to understand that something had gone wrong with the morning that no amount of careful charm was going to fix. Donald stood in the corridor for what could not have been more than 8 seconds and felt to him like the slow vertical descent of an elevator with a frayed cable. The mug in his hand was warm against his palm in a way that was now slightly nauseating. Through the open boardroom door, he could see William Hartwell still on his feet at the head of the table, both hands extended toward Jessica with the kind of welcome William had not extended to him in 15 days. He could see, beyond William's shoulder, the New York attorney from the consent decree compliance firm rising to his feet as well. He could see Margaret Voss, the senior independent director, the 73-year-old retired oncology researcher who had been on the Viridian board longer than anyone else, and who had been, Donald had always assumed, his quietest ally, leaning forward in her chair with both hands flat on the table and an expression on her face that Donald had not seen Margaret wear in the entire decade he had known her. It was something close to satisfaction. Donald set the mug down on the corridor console table next to the leather folio Jessica had picked up. He did not set it down quietly. He set it down with the small, deliberate click of a man trying to convince his own hands that they were still attached to a person in control of the morning. He smoothed the front of his blazer. He drew one slow breath in through his nose, and he walked through the boardroom door 3 full minutes after the meeting had been scheduled to begin, which in 22 years at Viridian Pharmaceuticals he had never once done. The room did not fall silent when he entered. It had already been silent. It became, if anything, slightly more silent, in the way that a room of 13 experienced corporate directors becomes silent when something has happened that none of them have yet been told about, but all of them have collectively decided they are about to learn. William looked up. His expression did not change. "Donald, good morning. Please take your seat." Donald walked the length of the table to the chair that had always been his, second from the head on the right-hand side, and he pulled it out, and he sat down, and he placed his palms flat on the table in a gesture that he hoped read as composed, and that in fact read as a man steadying himself against the surface of a small boat. Across the table, 2 seats down on the left-hand side, Jessica had taken the chair that had always been reserved for the chief executive officer, and she had placed her tablet face down on the walnut, and she had folded her hands in front of it, and she was waiting. William remained standing. He did not look at Donald, he looked at the room. Before we begin the formal quarterly review, I want to take a moment that I should have taken 7 days ago when the internal announcement went out, and that I am going to take now in person, because some moments deserve to happen in a room rather than in an email. He paused. Donald registered with the small, detached part of his mind that was still functioning normally, an extraordinarily good speaker when he wanted to be. It is my privilege, on behalf of the full board of directors of Viridian Pharmaceuticals, to formally introduce to the senior leadership of this company our incoming chief executive officer, Dr. Jessica Akosua-Mensah. There was a half-second of stillness. Then Margaret Voss began to clap. The New York attorney joined her. Then the general counsel. Then, one by one and within the span of perhaps 4 seconds, every other person at the table joined as well, with the single exception of Donald Pemberton, whose hands remained palms down and motionless on the walnut surface in front of him. The coffee mug that he had set on the corridor table 8 seconds earlier was, of course, not in the room. What was in the room was the small ceramic cup of water that a member of the catering staff had placed at Donald's seat before the meeting began, and Donald's right elbow, in the small involuntary contraction of a man whose body had registered something his mind was still refusing to process, caught the rim of the saucer as he tried to sit up straighter. The cup did not fall on the table. It fell off the table. It dropped, end over end, to the polished concrete floor of the boardroom, where it shattered with a sound that was substantially louder, in the quiet of the applause, than a small ceramic cup should reasonably have been allowed to make. Every head in the room turned toward Donald. Donald did not move. He looked down at the shards on the floor. He looked back up at William. He tried to arrange his face into the expression of a man who had merely had a small accident with a cup of water. The expression did not entirely arrive. Jessica had not turned her head. The applause settled. The shards stayed on the floor. An assistant moved to clear them, and William held up one hand without looking, and the assistant stopped. The shards remained where they were. William sat down. He turned his head toward Jessica and gave her the smallest of nods, and Jessica turned her tablet over, and she did not pick it up. She placed her right hand on top of it, as if she were anchoring something. "Thank you, William." Her voice carried through the room the way her voice had carried through the corridor. Low, even unhurried, the voice of a person who had spent 11 years asking the same question across a table from people who had practiced not answering it. Before we begin the quarterly review, I would like to take perhaps 4 minutes of the board's time to do something I believe is owed to this room. I would like to introduce myself beyond what you will have read in the announcement memorandum, because I do not believe it is possible to lead a company through a regulatory crisis if the company does not understand who it is being led by. Donald, across the table, had recovered just enough to drag the small forward-leaning posture of an engaged colleague onto his face. The shards by his right foot crunched very slightly under his shoe as he adjusted his weight. He did not look down. Jessica did not look at him either. She was speaking to the room. "I trained as a medicinal chemist at McGill and at Johns Hopkins. I spent 6 years in industry research at a mid-sized firm I will not name in this room, because the matter that ended my time there was eventually resolved without public attribution, and the people most harmed by it did not give permission for me to relitigate their privacy this morning. After I left industry, I joined the FDA. I spent 4 years in the Office of New Drugs and 7 years in the Office of Compliance. During the last 6 of those years, I served as the lead investigator and subsequently as director on the federal compliance matter that this room knows as the Glitherix settlement. The room did not move. The shards by Donald's foot did not crunch. Donald's hand, which had been resting on the table, contracted very slowly into a half fist and then released, and the half fist and the release happened over the course of perhaps 3 seconds, and not a single member of the Viridian board missed it. I want to be precise about what that means, because I believe precision is owed to the people in this room who are about to be working with me. It means that the closing memorandum on the federal action against Viridian Pharmaceuticals, the document that authorized the $2.3 billion aggregate settlement, and the consent decree obligations that this company is currently operating under, was drafted under my supervision and signed by my hand. It means that the investigative file on Glitherix, which runs to approximately 11,700 pages and which has been sealed by court order since March of this year, was assembled and indexed by the team I led. It means that I know, in granular forensic detail, every internal memorandum, every email thread, every dissolution stability report, every interim batch record, every personnel action, and every signature line that contributed to the launch of Glytherix in March of 2019, and to the subsequent 14 patient deaths and 311 hospitalizations that the public record now reflects. I know which scientists raised concerns, I know which executives received those concerns, I know which executives forwarded those concerns, and I know which executives buried them. Margaret Voss had not moved her hands from the table. The New York attorney had begun to take notes. The general counsel had stopped breathing for a moment that was noticeable only because his shoulders, which had been moving in the small regular rhythm of a man at a meeting, had gone perfectly still. Donald's face had begun very slowly to drain of color. It was not the panicked flush of a man being publicly accused. It was the slower, deeper color change of a man who has just registered that he is sitting in a room with the only person on earth who has read every document he has ever asked his assistant to file. I tell you this not to relitigate the settlement, which is closed, and not to violate any sealing order, which I have not and will not. I tell you this because the board has chosen, in retaining me, to send a particular message to the regulators, to the patient advocacy community, to your shareholders, and to your employees about what kind of company Viridian Pharmaceuticals intends to be over the next decade. I intend to honor that choice, which brings me to the second introduction I would like to make this morning. She looked at William. William nodded once. Jessica turned her head toward the door at the back of the boardroom. The door opened. The woman who walked through the back door of the boardroom was 45 years old, 5'4", with shoulder-length black hair pulled into a low ponytail and a pair of horn-rimmed glasses that she had been wearing since her doctoral thesis defense at Stanford in 2011. She wore a dark gray suit and a pale blue blouse and a small silver pendant in the shape of a benzene ring that her late mother had given her for her 25th birthday. She carried a single black leather portfolio under her left arm. She did not look at Donald Pemberton. She looked at the chair across the table from him, the one that had always been reserved for the chief scientific officer, and she walked the length of the room to that chair, and she pulled it out and she sat down. Donald registered her in stages. He registered the shape of her first, then the ponytail, then the glasses, then the pendant. He had given that pendant a small dismissive glance at a holiday party in 2017, and he had said to a colleague after Rachel had walked away that he could not understand why a woman with a doctorate in chemistry would wear something that looked like a high school science fair award. The colleague had not laughed. Donald had remembered the lack of laughter. He had not remembered why. He remembered now. He remembered everything now. He remembered the Friday afternoon in July of 2018 when Rachel Liu had sat across his desk and had explained, with the careful precision of a person who had triple-checked her own data, why the dissolution variance on the Glytherix coating was not within an acceptable envelope. He remembered the small, careful smile he had given her. He remembered asking her whether she was certain she wanted to be the chemist who had pushed back on the company's most important launch in a decade. He remembered the phone call he had made to Human Resources 11 days later, in which he had used the phrase performance concerns of a sustained nature and the phrase cultural fit issues with the broader formulation team, and he remembered the careful satisfaction he had felt when the badge deactivation report had crossed his desk that Friday afternoon. He remembered all of it, and he remembered it in the span of approximately 4 seconds, and at the end of those 4 seconds, the color that had been draining from his face had reached his lower jaw, and the small, involuntary tremor that had begun in his right hand had migrated up his arm to his shoulder, and his mouth had opened very slightly, and nothing had come out. I would like to introduce, Jessica said, Dr. Rachel Liu, who will be joining Viridian Pharmaceuticals on Monday morning as our incoming Chief Scientific Officer. Rachel and I have worked together closely on the Glytherix compliance matter over the last 6 years, in capacities that the sealing order continues to protect and that I will therefore not elaborate on in this room. What I will say is that there is no scientist working in the cardiometabolic space in this country today whom I trust more completely on questions of formulation integrity, regulatory candor, and the moral obligations a pharmaceutical company owes to the patients who take its products. The board has reviewed Rachel's appointment and has unanimously confirmed her in the role. Rachel placed her portfolio on the table. She still had not looked at Donald. She opened the portfolio. She removed a single sheet of paper. She placed it on the walnut surface in front of her. She did not slide it across the table. She simply placed it where it was and rested her hand lightly on the corner. From across the table, Donald could not read the paper. He did not need to read the paper. He knew, with the kind of certainty that arrives in a person's chest before it arrives in their mind, exactly what document Rachel Liu had just placed on the boardroom table on her first official appearance as the incoming Chief Scientific Officer of Viridian Pharmaceuticals. It was the third memorandum, the one from June of 2018, the one she had hand-delivered to him in a sealed envelope. The one he had assumed she had not retained a copy of, because Viridian Pharmaceuticals' document retention policy had clearly specified that drafts of internal scientific memoranda were corporate property and were not to be removed from the premises. The one that contained on the bottom of the second page his own initials in his own handwriting next to the small notation "Received and reviewed, file no action," dated July 6, 2018. Donald, in his own initials, had unintentionally signed the document that proved he had read the warning he had subsequently denied receiving. Rachel had kept the copy. She had kept it for 7 years. She had kept it through her badge deactivation, through her 6 months of unemployment, through her 60% salary cut at the biotech in Cambridge, through her phone call to the FDA, through 6 years of cooperation with Dr. Jessica Mensa's investigation, and through the sealing order that had protected her identity until this morning. She had kept it for this room. Donald Pemberton did the thing a certain kind of man does when the floor he has been standing on for 22 years drops out from under him in a room full of his peers. He tried to speak. He cleared his throat. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He cleared his throat again. The sound was small and dry and traveled across the walnut table in a way that none of the 13 people in the room would forget for the rest of their professional lives. "William," he said. His voice was not the voice that had said, "Sweetheart, top these off in the corridor 12 minutes earlier." It was thinner. It was higher. It belonged to a different man, one who had not slept for 15 days, and who had just understood that the morning had not, in fact, contained any opportunity to take back authority from the universe. "William, I would like a moment to confer with the board in executive session before we proceed." William did not look at him. William looked at Jessica. Jessica looked at William. William turned slowly in his chair, and he addressed Donald for the first time that morning. "Donald, the board concluded its executive session at 6:15 this morning. The actions arising from that session were memorialized in writing at 7:40. Dr. Mensa is in possession of those actions. They will be conveyed to you by Dr. Mensa in a one-on-one meeting that she has scheduled for 10 o'clock this morning in her office. Until that meeting, I would ask that you remain in this room, that you participate in the quarterly review as a sitting officer of the company, and that you conduct yourself with the dignity that 22 years of service to Viridian Pharmaceuticals has earned you the opportunity to demonstrate this morning." Donald sat very still. He understood, in the way that a man understands the contents of his own obituary while reading it over his morning coffee, that William had just told him in the politest possible language that he was finished, that the firing was already documented, that the meeting at 10 o'clock was a formality, and that the only remaining question was whether he was going to spend the next 90 minutes of the quarterly review behaving like a man who deserved a clean exit or behaving like a man who deserved the alternative. He nodded once. The nod was small and broken and almost imperceptible. It was the same nod that Captain Richard Hammond would have recognized instantly, although Captain Richard Hammond did not exist in this story and never would. Jessica looked at her tablet. She picked it up. She did not open it immediately. "I would like, before we move into the quarterly review proper, to address one element of this morning that I believe deserves to be named in this room rather than left unsaid. At approximately 8:26 this morning, in the corridor immediately outside this boardroom, Dr. Pemberton encountered me and, mistaking me for a member of the catering staff, asked me to refill the coffee carafes before the meeting began. I am naming this not because I am injured by it. I am not. I have spent 30 years in laboratories, in industry, and in the federal government, and I have been mistaken for the catering staff, the cleaning staff, the administrative staff, and on one memorable occasion at a regulatory conference in Bethesda, the spouse of a male colleague 12 years my junior. I have developed over the course of those 30 years a thick enough skin that this morning's encounter did not register on me personally in any way that requires the board's sympathy. I am naming it because it is relevant to the structural matter this board has retained me to address." She paused. The room held. Viridian Pharmaceuticals is operating under a federal consent decree that requires this company, over the next 7 years, to demonstrate a documented cultural change in its scientific leadership. The Office of Compliance, in negotiating that decree, was specific about what cultural change means. It does not mean a new code of conduct posted on the intranet. It does not mean a mandatory training module that employees click through in 9 minutes. It means a measurable change in who is heard, who is promoted, who is fired, and who is allowed to walk into a corridor on the 42nd floor of this building and be assumed, by a senior officer of this company, to belong somewhere other than the room they are in fact walking toward. The Glythyrix matter was, at its root, a failure of who was heard. Dr. Liu was heard, and her supervisor escalated her concerns, and the senior officer to whom those concerns were finally escalated made a calculation about who in his organization was worth listening to and who was not. 14 patients died because of that calculation. This morning, in the corridor outside this room, that same calculation was performed again, in a smaller and less consequential form, by the same officer. I am not here to punish the officer for that calculation. I am here to ensure that the company stops performing it. The quarterly review proceeded. It proceeded for 93 minutes, and Donald Pemberton sat through every minute of it, and he spoke when he was directly addressed, and he gave numerical updates on the Phase 2 oncology candidate and the Phase 3 cardiovascular candidate and the life cycle management program for the company's flagship anti-inflammatory product, and he did all of it in the voice of a man performing the role of chief scientific officer while a slow internal accounting ran somewhere behind his eyes of every choice he had made in 22 years, that he could not now defend in a room with Dr. Jessica Mensah and Dr. Rachel Liu sitting across the table from him. At 11:52, William adjourned the meeting. The board members stood. Margaret Voss walked the length of the table to where Rachel Liu was still seated. Rachel stood up. Margaret extended her hand. Dr. Liu, I am Margaret Voss. I sat on the board of this company in 2018. I read the personnel file that authorized your termination. I read the line about performance concerns of a sustained nature. I did not push hard enough on that line at the time. I am sorry. I will not make that mistake again. Rachel took the older woman's hand. She did not let go immediately. Dr. Voss, I appreciate the sentiment. I would prefer that the company spend its energy on the next chemist who is in the position I was in 7 years ago, rather than on the chemist I was. There are several of them in this building today. I intend to find them. Margaret nodded. She did not let go of Rachel's hand either. Then I will help you find them. Donald did not approach Jessica's chair. He did not approach Rachel's chair. He walked out of the boardroom at 11:54, and he walked the length of the executive suite to his own office, and he closed the door behind him, and he sat down in the leather chair he had purchased with company funds in 2015, and he stared at the molecular sculpture on the wall opposite his desk for a period of time that his assistant would later estimate at approximately 40 minutes. At 10 o'clock the following morning, in Dr. Mensah's office on the 43rd floor, Donald received a separation agreement that had been drafted by outside counsel over the preceding 3 weeks. The terms were not generous. They were not punitive either. They were, in the particular vocabulary of corporate exits, consistent with the documented facts of the matter. He signed the agreement at 10:41. He cleared his desk by Friday afternoon. He did not give a goodbye speech. There was no all-hands meeting. The company announced his retirement, by press release, on Monday morning, with 2 sentences that thanked him for his service and did not specify any of the circumstances of his departure. 3 weeks later, the Consent Decree Compliance Office at the FDA received, from Dr. Jessica Mensah personally, a 31-page report that documented, with reference to internal Viridian records that the company had voluntarily produced, the specific personnel decision in July of 2018 that had preceded the Glythyrix launch. The report did not name Rachel by her sealed designation. It named the decision. It named the decision-maker. It named the consequences. The Department of Justice declined to reopen the criminal matter on the basis that the underlying conduct had been resolved by the sealed settlement. But the FDA did issue, 11 months later, a public guidance document on whistleblower protection in pharmaceutical formulation chemistry that referenced, by serial number and without further description, the case file that Dr. Mensah had submitted. The guidance document was subsequently adopted, in part or in whole, by 4 foreign regulatory agencies and by the World Health Organization. Inside Viridian Pharmaceuticals, the structural review that Jessica had announced on her first morning took 18 months. It produced 162 recommendations. The company implemented 158 of them. Rachel Liu personally interviewed every senior chemist in the formulation division and every junior chemist who had been hired in the 2 years preceding her arrival, and she found, in the course of those interviews, 9 separate instances of internal scientific concerns that had been documented and subsequently set aside by mid-level managers in a manner that Rachel described, in her quarterly report to the board, as structurally similar to the antecedent conditions of the Glythorix matter. The board authorized the immediate escalation of all 9. 6 of them turned out to be resolvable through additional studies. 2 of them resulted in delayed regulatory submissions. 1 of them resulted in the voluntary withdrawal of a Phase 2 candidate that had been projected to generate $400 million in peak annual sales. The Viridian stock dropped 6% the day of the withdrawal announcement. It recovered within 4 weeks. By the end of Jessica's first fiscal year as Chief Executive Officer, the stock had appreciated 19% against an industry benchmark of 7%, and 3 analysts had begun publicly describing the company as the most credible regulatory turnaround in the cardiometabolic space in a decade. 18 months after the morning in the corridor, Jessica flew to Accra. She did not go for business. She went home. Her father was 81 years old by then, and his hands were no longer steady enough to compound medications by the milliliter, but he still sat behind the counter of the small pharmacy in the Adabraka district for 3 hours every afternoon, because the neighborhood had not yet stopped bringing him their questions and he had not yet figured out how to refuse them. Jessica sat with him on a Tuesday afternoon in the small back room she had done her homework in as a child. She told him about Viridian Pharmaceuticals. She told him about Rachel Liu. She told him about the structural review and the 9 concerns and the voluntary withdrawal of the Phase 2 candidate and the recovery of the stock price. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in the voice he had used at the kitchen table when she was 12 years old, "Jessica, the 11 children in the next district, their families, are they still alive?" "Some of them, yes. When you have time, you will go and see them." "I will, yes. And the chemist at your company, the one who kept the memorandum for 7 years. Does she know what she saved?" Jessica thought about the question. She thought about Rachel sitting in her new office on the 42nd floor of the Hartwell Tower, with the silver benzene ring pendant her late mother had given her resting against the pale blue blouses she still wore 3 times a week, and the 17 junior chemists who had begun, in the months since Rachel's installation, to leave their office doors open in a way they had not left them open in years. "I think she is beginning to, yes." Her father nodded slowly. He reached across the small table, and he took his daughter's hand in his own, and his grip was not as strong as it had been 30 years earlier, but it was strong enough. "Then the paperwork mattered. The signatures mattered. You have done what I asked you to do." 6 months after Jessica's visit to Accra, Rachel Liu stood in a small auditorium at Stanford University and addressed a graduating class of 31 PhD candidates in chemistry, 12 of whom were women, 6 of whom were women of color, and one of whom, in the 3rd row, was a 28-year-old Ghanaian-American doctoral candidate named Akua Mensah Boateng, who had no relation to Jessica, but who would, 4 years later, accept a position as a junior formulation chemist at Viridian Pharmaceuticals on the same floor of the same building, where Donald Pemberton had once stood in a corridor holding an empty cup. Rachel's talk was 28 minutes long. The final 2 minutes of it consisted of the following sentences, which were subsequently transcribed and republished in 3 different industry trade journals, and which became, over the following decade, one of the most quoted passages in the literature on pharmaceutical whistleblower protection. "You will, in your careers, find data that someone above you does not want to see. You will be told that the data is within an acceptable envelope. You will be told that you are perhaps not yet experienced enough to understand the broader context. You will be told that there is a launch timeline. You will be asked, with a small, careful smile, whether you are certain you want to be the chemist who pushed back. I want you to know 2 things this afternoon. The first is that the smile is not friendly. It has never been friendly. The smile is the most important warning sign you will ever receive in your professional life, and I am asking you to learn to read it. The second is that somewhere, in some office, in some building, in some city, there is a regulator who is waiting for your call. She has been waiting for it for her entire career. She will pick up the phone. Rachel did not name Dr. Jessica Mensah in the talk. She did not need to. Everyone in the room understood. So here's what I want you to sit with, and I want your honest answer in the comments. Not about Jessica, not about Donald, not about Rachel, about the corridor, the 30 seconds before any of it was resolved. When a senior executive walked past a woman holding a tablet and made a calculation about who she was in his own building on a Tuesday morning in front of no audience and with no consequences he could foresee, What calculation has been made about you, in a hallway, by someone who never looked at your face? And what calculation have you, perhaps, made about someone else? If this story touched something real in you, share it, because the conversation it starts is the whole point. Like, subscribe, leave a comment with the moment that hit hardest, and I will see you in the next one.